Hello everyone, and welcome back to Crash Course A-Push. Today we'll be talking about Reconstruction, the era after the Civil War. It started in 1865 all the way up until 1877. It was started by President Johnson as an attempt to rebuild the South after the war. But were his attempts really successful, and what were the lasting effects of this period? Well, let's find out. Stan, the intro. So it all started back in 1865. The war was drawing to a close and the country needed a way to deal with these newly emancipated slaves. So as a result, it created the Freedmen's Bureau, which would give money, legal assistance, land, and housing to these slaves. However, due to lack of funding, the program was not able to successfully do its job at the time. So things were complicated even farther when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in April 1865. This is where President Johnson took over and began his plans for Reconstruction. Now, Johnson's plan was very lenient on the South, which caused a lot of tension between him and Congress during his presidency. Now, coming out of the Reconstruction era were three of the most important amendments in American history: the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery in the United States and prohibited its use. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship to any person born or naturalized in the United States, forbid any person from being denied their life, liberty, or property, and guaranteed all men equal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment stated that no man would be denied the right to vote based on the color of their skin, essentially giving African Americans the right to vote. Now, let's take to the thought board. The first amendment that dealt with slavery was the 13th Amendment. Ratified on December 6th of 1865, the 13th Amendment stated that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So for those who couldn't tell, slavery was now illegal. In response, the Southerners began enacting the Black Codes, attempts to restrict the freedoms of the former slaves. These laws forced blacks to pay a fine if they had a job other than a farmer or a servant, and they could be arrested if they couldn't provide proof of employment each January. Under the Black Codes, African Americans were granted certain rights, like the right to own property and marry, but they were severely limited in their activities, work, and social mobility. Even though blacks tried to make a living for themselves, whites found a way to cause difficulty for their former slaves. They did this through a system known as sharecropping, where whites would allow blacks to use their land for agriculture, and in return would gain a portion of their crops, usually around 50%. In addition, they also had to pay for any farming tools they used, causing many blacks to spiral into debt they couldn't recover from. The KKK was not only opposed to African Americans, they opposed two other important groups of whites, the Scalawags and the Carpetbaggers. The Scalawags were white Southerners who saw an advantage in supporting the policies of Reconstruction, and were also a major group of Southern Republicans. Many were either non-slave-holding farmers, merchants, or other workers who had remained loyal to the Union. The other group, the Carpetbaggers, was comprised of Northern people who had traveled to the South looking for profit. Southerners at first welcomed these people because they thought the Northerners would bring much-needed money to the destroyed South. However, the Southerners realized that the Carpetbaggers only wanted to profit from the Southern misfortunes, and began to despise them. To end Reconstruction, the Compromise of 1877 was passed. The Republicans and the Democrats worked together to resolve the election and other issues within the nation. This compromise ensured that the Republicans would secure the next presidential spot, which would go to Rutherford B. Hayes, as long as they did the following. First, federal troops had to be removed from the South. Second, legislation that would encourage industrialization had to be passed. Third, they had to appoint Democrats to patronage positions. And finally, they would have to put Democrats in the presidential cabinet. This ending of Reconstruction also marked the ending of a brief civil rights movement, as the next serious attempt at equality was in the 1950s. And that is the story of how Sally Hemings got her
Well, I guess it's time for the mystery document. The rules are simple. I read the document, try and guess the author. If I'm successful, I escape the punishment. I repeat that the adoption of the 15th Amendment to the Constitution completes the greatest civil change and constitutes the most important event that has ever occurred since the nation came into life. The change will be beneficial in proportion to the heed that is given to the urgent recommendation of Washington. If these recommendations were important, then with a population of but a few million, how much more important now with a population of 40 million and increasing in a rapid ratio? Well, luckily this is a pretty easy one. And judging by the tone of the document, I can clearly tell that this is actually Andrew Johnson writing to Abraham Lincoln. It's actually Andrew Johnson.
And now we come to one of the most infamous groups of the time, the KKK. Now, the goal of the Klans were to reestablish white supremacy and prevent blacks from gaining any rights that they may have been granted from the 15th Amendment. They did this in numerous ways, such as violence against Republican voters and leaders, scare tactics to convince blacks not to vote, and lynchings of people they did not agree with. And though Congress passed legislation to hinder their growth, the KKK still continued to develop because of many of the Democratic victories in the South.
So the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was one last attempt by the national government to protect the rights of black citizens. The law said that any unequal treatment of blacks in public transportation, public accommodations, and jury services was illegal and prohibited. The law could have brought some much-needed equality into the lives of blacks, but sadly, a few years after it was passed, it was declared unconstitutional, allowing Southerners to continue their unfair treatment of African Americans. Mr. Green, Mr. Green, Mr. Green! But now Reconstruction was over, right? And so everything's just hunky-dory again. Well, me from the past, Reconstruction was a success in that it did readmit all the southern states back into the Union and create a unified country once again. And it did force them to acknowledge the new amendments to the Constitution. However, it did not fix many of the deep-seated issues within the country, such as the social differences and racial differences in the South and the sectional issues within the nation. Thanks for watching Crash Course A Push.